I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm going to be talking about a post-pandemic political strategy of analyzing our own data. And in the last few weeks, I've posted several comments that said, the pandemic is over, and they were all deleted like that. Caitlin Johnstone has an article on why censorship by algorithm is much more invasive and dangerous than censorship by human, which clearly is what mine was. Now, I think it's also more telling. What is it they don't want us to know? So now the CDC in the US has announced that they will no longer collect COVID-19 death data from hospitals. They're eliminating the entire box. There's many people who've speculated that this is for political purposes. They don't want us to know how many people are dying. But I think it's exactly the opposite. If there are not people dying, there's no more rationale for vaccines, much less mandates. No rationale for masks, for lockdowns. They can't keep us afraid. If there's no data to contradict it, then the anecdote is what can keep the fear going. So I think this has been a slide of the king to the right in response to the checkmate that was done by those who released the Omicron variant, those who are known as the white hat scientist in colloquial language, that if that was released as a way of giving everyone natural immunity at the lowest possible mortality rate, that is something that could have ended this. But they don't want us to know that it's ended. So how can we counter that narrative and use this in a way to accomplish our long-term goal, which for me is control at the local level of our labor and our assets? But first, I want to talk about the practical utility of spirituality. In Russell Brand's last episode, he interviewed Farron Cotton, and she said, spirituality isn't the side dish, it's the main course. And that's how I think of it. In my last episode, in the context of all being one, I was worried that because many of my viewers are attracted by the vaccine analysis, that I would lose them on the spiritual. And I found that I lost one and gained three. And maybe the one that I lost was the commenter who wrote, "What a pants load." But then in dialogue with him, where he said, "This is occult stuff, lady," I realized that it wasn't my entertaining of the possibility that there are things to the world that are not what meet the eye. That wasn't what he objected to. What he objected to was my refusal to believe in the existence of evil. So when I look at people, whether I think of it as a supernatural thing or I think of us as having pretty much strapped ourselves into existence with monkey genes and natural selection, that either way, we are the product of nature and nurture, and we are all morally equal. And that is a good thing, because the price of superiority is hopelessness. It's despair, because other people can't be trusted. I think that faith is faith in each other. And that's the kind of faith that I'm going to be talking about today, and how we can use that faith to our advantage. One commenter on Charles Eisenstein's Substack has written, "We have only one job now, to understand who and what we are." I couldn't agree more, and I think that that includes who we are into relationship to each other. When I think about what will make us fail, it's our internal unexamined contradictions, those paradigms that we accept where we're taking the bribe along with the threat and keeping the empire in place because there's a piece of us that doesn't want to bring down the empire because there's part of it that's working for us. In my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, I go through 28 different unexamined paradigms and show how those are contradictions that will thwart us if we want to dismantle the empire. Because how a hierarchy works is it says, okay, if you accept that I have authority over you, I give you authority over all of these other people. And that's what we need to reject. I think that every disagreement I've ever had with anyone has come down to the same thing of me saying, here's why we're no better than anyone else. And that has almost always been perceived as me saying, here's why I'm better than you, why I'm smarter or more moral, more clever. And I think that's because once you're in a competitive mind frame, that projection is perception, that you see what it is that you are already in that paradigm of. So we together need to get over this. We need to figure out a way of working together and refining our ideas and our strategies without being competitive with one another. Right now is an especially hard time, I think, to have faith in other people. There is so much hostility and attack, and there is so much tenderness and caring. I see this happening both in my personal life and also online. There are places where people are being so supportive of each other, and there are stories that are heartbreaking. So, how do we come to a place of finding agreement from where we're at? I think the first thing we need to do is change the question and make the question one that I think we can all agree on as an important question. So that question is not, are the vaccines safe or effective? That question is, are federal agencies enabling corruption? And now let's look at corruption, because I'm not saying that the agencies are corrupt. Agencies, like corporations, are not people. Agencies don't have agency. They are a system. And so what they do is enable or not. They allow corruption, and maybe, to go even further, they don't allow someone who is not corrupt in order to function within their system. So what is corruption? Corruption is prioritizing private gain over the public good. How can we determine whether that potential for corruption is there? I think it always goes back to the data. I love data. As I've mentioned before, I am a data junkie. And the reason I love data is because it always tells the truth if you ask it an honest question. And there are methodologies for determining whether your question is honest, whether the conclusions actually match the data, whether the hypothesis is held up by the data. So that's, I think, the place that we need to go to. This question about the data that we've been given came up when I was in a discussion on Matt Taibbi's Substack. And I was talking about the study that shows 3,000 counties where there was no correlation between the number vaccinated and the percentage of COVID cases or deaths or hospitalizations. And then country by country, it showed that there was actually a positive correlation. And one commenter wrote and said, well, look at these data reports, and one was from Arizona and one was from Washington State. How do you explain that? Because they clearly showed that someone who was unvaccinated was far more likely at a multiple to have all of those things happen to them. So I went to bed that night, and in the middle of the night, I got up and came back downstairs because something was bugging me. And I pulled up those two reports. And what was evident is that they were formatted by the same people. that they were not some data flunky who was in some back room of some hospital who was putting out these reports. These were executive board level reports that had the takeaway point: unvaxxed 3 times more likely to die in 20-point type. They had a dozen graphs. Other than a little bit of a choice of presentation, they were clearly coming from the same source. So for that person, the fact that this data matched was evidence to him that clearly it had to be independently produced. Whereas to me, looking at those 2 reports and the similarity made me sure that those were coming from the same place. And now my suspicions have been confirmed because the CDC is no longer asking for COVID-19 death data. So that means that all of this hospital information has been bypassing the county, bypassing the state, and going to a centralized federal agency who then massages the data in whichever way they do and sends it back as a presentation of conclusions that are in opposition to the ones that can be found by using public data on overall vaccination rates and overall county or country death, hospitalization, and case rates. So one of those has to not be true. How do we find out? I think that our county supervisors and our city councils and our health officials at the local level have been making some very hard decisions. And I think that those are decisions that probably do keep them up at night, that half of businesses have shuttered, that we've had a crisis in mental health in young people and children. We've had home foreclosures. People have lost their life savings. People have lived and died in isolation. And I believe that that is not something that any of the people that we work with wanted. So now that there's no longer a collection of data that I think we as the public are interested in, should we do our own collection of that data? And while we're at it, should we do an audit of the 2021 data that we sent to the CDC and find out how it matches the conclusions that came back? That way, we would have city council or our county supervisors who were working with us, and it would really only take one. It would take one person who says, yes, I'm willing to back that. I'd like to know. And that would be a hard thing, I think, for anyone to say they didn't want to know. So that way we can do the analysis of the raw data for ourselves and just find out once and for all why there are these anomalies between data that is country or county-wide and the data that's actually coming back from federal agencies. In a potential example that there are things beyond the senses that are conspiring to help us, as I was preparing to record this episode, I got an article sent by my friend Robin Upton this morning. Now, Robin is a Brit living in Bangladesh, and he is a shining example of what one person can accomplish with a smattering of technical skills. Robin took over an independent radio show called Unwelcome Guest, which is at unwelcomeguest.net, which is 2 hours a week and has gone on for more than 10 years. So it is a college education in one show. And he also puts out Wiki Spooks, which is all the things that they don't want you to know. So the article that I was sent by Robin is called Official Mortality Data for England Suggests Systematic Miscategorization of Vaccine Status and Uncertain Effectiveness of COVID-19 Vaccine. In previous articles, what these authors have said is that the most accurate risk-benefit analysis for the COVID vaccine is to look at all-cause mortality divided between vaccinated and unvaccinated, and preferably broken into age groups. So they've asked the Office of National Statistics in England to give them that information, with which they did comply for November of 21. Then they look at all-cause mortality for those in the 10 to 59-year-old age range. And what they found was very curious, that when the vaccine program was first rolled out, those who were vaccinated were much less likely to die than those who were unvaccinated. But after about week 5, the lines crossed, and then those who were vaccinated had 2 times or more a greater chance of dying than those who were unvaccinated. They don't draw conclusions from that. They just are presenting the data. And then they analyzed the groups for each decade in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what they found is that the unvaccinated had a spike in deaths and then went down. And each time they spiked and they went down as they rolled out the program for that age group. So in looking into the data, what they found is that they only counted someone as being vaccinated 21 days after they had received the vaccination shot. And so anyone who died within those 21 days was counted as unvaccinated. So they don't draw conclusions, and I think this is so smart of them. What they look at are all the possible other hypotheses for why that could occur other than the vaccine itself, and they eliminate every other possible alternative and show why it is statistically implausible, and then call on those who have produced the data and come to the opposite conclusion, that the unvaccinated are far more likely to die, and have them explain why this is. Why do these spikes occur and then go down to being the same rate? So I'm suggesting that we all ask our county supervisors to do this audit. It would only take one supervisor in one county in order to be able to give the lie. And other places are using that strategy, that they are calling into question the emergency use authorization and doing it as a strategy across 30 different states, and saying that we only need one to win in order to get the disclosure that we're asking for. In the meantime, I'd suggest that we look at corruption in federal agencies by looking at this book on infodemic, RFK, and the real Anthony Fauci, and also look at this on censorship and media. Thank you, and I hope you subscribe.